Tropical Storm Bret currently is strengthening as it continues to head further westward. Take a look at the water vapor imagery. We do see that there's a lot more convective activity compared to yesterday around the center of circulation. We're seeing a large blow up of thunderstorms going on, and we don't see a lot of wind shear over this storm right now. We see that the outflow clouds are moving in all directions, which represents that this storm is breathing well. There isn't really a strong upper level flow that's forcing the outflow clouds towards one direction, which shows that it's under a lightly sheared environment at this time, and we don't see a lot of dry air ahead of it either. So in most cases, when we see a tropical cyclone like this, it would have a pretty good chance of rapidly intensifying, especially as it continues to absorb the very warm main development region waters, which at this point in the month of June, it's at its record high when it comes to sea surface temperatures. However, the thing that's expected to inhibit this storm from now until its demise later, I'll say into next week, is due to the fact that the lower level winds are quite strong. So that's pretty much forcing the lower level center away from a lot of this convection, where the lower level center is located slightly towards the west of where all this convection is located. And what that means is that the energy is a lot more spread out when we don't see the mid-level and upper level energy coincide or move at within the same direction as a lower level center. So that's definitely going to inhibit this storm as it moves further eastward, despite the low upper level winds and the lack of dry air. And the storm is somewhat asymmetrical due to that fact, but there is still that possibility this could develop into a strong tropical storm, and the lesser Antilles could experience major impacts, and potentially other Caribbean islands could experience impacts from this tropical storm as well. The other disturbance we're watching is, of course, Invest 93L, which now is likely to develop into a tropical storm. And same thing as with the case with Bret. This is under a lightly sheared environment. We don't see a lot of dry air. There is a lack of convective activity for this to be considered a tropical storm, but that convective activity is expected to enhance over time once this low pressure system continues to head further eastward. And soon we're going to likely see enough convective activity for the pressure to drop along the surface, for the rotation to build, and for the center of circulation to develop a closed eye wall for this to be considered a tropical storm in the very near future. Here's a current look at the wind shear map for much of the northern Atlantic, and we do see at where Tropical Storm Bret is located and where what likely will become Tropical Storm Cindy is located. We do see that the wind shear is fairly light for the most part, where the upper level winds are mainly hovering around 10 to 15 knots, which is considered favorable for tropical cyclone intensification, and that's what's expected as Bret continues to head further eastward, despite the fact that the lower level winds are still a little bit too strong for this to strengthen as fast. It's still expected to strengthen, but we do see just to the north of it, there's a decent amount of wind shear that could potentially inhibit it if it were to make a slight adjustment to the track, if it were to move further northward. But this wind shear is expected to subside, and for the most part, Tropical Storm Bret as well as Invest 93L will stay in this small area where the wind shear will remain relatively light for the most part. And here's the current probability that Invest 93L will develop. So within the next 48 hours, we have a high 70% chance of this tropical disturbance developing. So more likely than not, we're at the very least going to see a tropical storm, at least a tropical depression within the next 48 hours, and possibly a tropical storm. And we do see that Bret has already intensified into a tropical storm. Its current wind speed is at 45 miles per hour. It's moving west at around 16 miles per hour, which is relatively fast, which is the reason why the lower level center is moving a little bit too fast to for the convective activity to catch up, which is the reason why we're seeing that dispersion of energy, which would weaken the storm typically, but it still is expected to strengthen. Taking a look at the latest run of the GFS model, we have seen a slight change with the forecast when it comes to the trajectory of Tropical Storm Bret, because before there were a good deal of ensemble members still expecting Tropical Storm Bret to move further northward to potentially directly impact Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. That idea has subsided for now, as the GFS model is now taking this storm system straight westward rather than taking a track that's a little bit further northward to where it would directly impact the islands. There's still time to iron out the forecast, but I'll say the most likely scenario is that this will move primarily due west. It seems like a GFS model has gotten a good idea of how strong this ridge will be just to the north of it, as the GFS model is currently expecting this ridge to be a little bit stronger than it initially anticipated. So more likely than not, we're going to see this tropical storm move towards pretty much due west, which could potentially avoid the bigger Caribbean islands such as Hispaniola and Puerto Rico from direct impacts, which is certainly good news. However, you still could experience at least some impacts in those areas, such as heavy rainfall and gusty wind. So you still want to be aware of this in those islands, even if this doesn't move further northward. Taking a look at the GFS model's 500 millibar height anomaly, we exactly see why the GFS model wants to steer this further westward. We see that the GFS model, instead of yesterday where it wanted this trough to dig a little bit further down for this to erode the ridge, the GFS model is expecting this ridge to be stronger than anticipated. So this will primarily move due west, which should directly impact the Lesser Antilles with tropical storm force or potentially hurricane force conditions if this were to develop into a hurricane, which is still certainly possible. The conditions aren't completely unfavorable for this to develop into a hurricane, so the Lesser Antilles definitely needs to pay very close attention to this, and in fact prepare now, since it's likely you're going to experience at the very least tropical storm force conditions, and it could potentially be even more intense than that. So you definitely want to start preparing along those islands. And for Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, you still need to watch out for this, because there's still that possibility it could move further northward, although the GFS model has been leaning against that idea with a stronger ridge, and so has the European model. So I'll say most likely this won't directly impact Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, but still watch out for enhanced rainfall. The only way we could see this move northward towards the Caribbean islands is if the computer models shift their forecast to the point where this ridge would erode. This low pressure system will be a little bit stronger than anticipated and erode this ridge a little bit more, to the point where this could have an open area to move further northward, but that's looking less likely at this time, as the computer models are now getting a good agreement that this will primarily move to the west. Take a look at the relative humidity forecast to show you guys why this storm isn't expected to rapidly intensify as this moves further westward. And the clear reason why is because this storm will become more and more lopsided by the time, and asymmetrical by the time it approaches the Caribbean, because the lower level winds are just moving too fast for the upper level winds and the moisture that's located in the upper levels to keep up, and that will keep the storm a little bit less vertically aligned between the upper levels and the mid levels and the lower levels of the atmosphere, which means that the energy will be more spread out. All the air molecules will spiral around a low pressure system in a more spread out manner, which means that the wind speed will decrease, the amount of the air pressure will increase, which means that this storm won't intensify as much with a storm that's not very vertically aligned between the different levels of the atmosphere. We clearly do see this because earlier during the past few hours, the GFS model, we clearly see that it's showing that this storm was a lot more symmetrical. While it's still somewhat asymmetrical, there's still a good deal of moisture on the western side of this storm, which means that all the energy is focused in right over the center of circulation for the most part, between the upper levels, the mid levels, and the lower levels of the atmosphere, which means that the wind speed will increase, the air molecules will converge more, lower the pressure along the surface, and that allows the storm to intensify. But we see that as the storm continues to head further and further eastward, the low pressure center moves a little bit too fast to keep up with the upper level moisture, which means that this storm, pretty much the energy is a lot more spread out, and we don't see the storm strengthen as much as it could under favorable conditions like this, where the upper level winds are relatively weak. There isn't a ton of dry air, but since this storm is moving so fast, it's pretty much gonna make the western side of this storm a little bit more dry. So we're gonna see a completely asymmetrical storm. So just because as the storm continues to head towards the Lesser Antilles, just because it might be dry initially as it's making landfall, does not mean that will continue, as all the weather will be on the eastern side of this storm. So in the Lesser Antilles, don't underestimate the first this storm, just because the first half is relatively dry, because the second half is expected to be a lot more impactful when it comes to rainfall as well as gusty winds. So make sure to keep that in mind. But eventually the storm will become too asymmetrical for all the energy to converge in one area, and that means the storm is expected to dissipate once it approaches the Caribbean. But the upper level winds won't be very weak, so that makes me think that this will strengthen just a little bit before it approaches the Caribbean. But then eventually the wind shear will increase as this continues to head further and further westward. The storm is already very asymmetrical, so this will likely dissipate by the time this approaches the western Caribbean. We clearly see the same thing with the European model scenario, where the European model is also expecting this Tropical Storm Bret to be very lopsided, which will inevitably put this storm at cap when it comes to intensity. And we do see that Tropical Storm Cindy, or what will likely become Tropical Storm Cindy, still maintains its strength, but it's going to deal with a similar problem that Tropical Storm Bret is dealing with, which is the fact that the lower level winds are just going to be a little bit too strong to keep up with the upper level moisture, or at least slow down for the upper level moisture to keep up. So that will make a very lopsided storm that's going to be very difficult to intensify that much due to that fact. And the wind shear should increase as Cindy moves further northward, which will lead to this storm's likely demise. And it's unlikely that it's going to move far south enough to impact the Caribbean islands. But for Tropical Storm Bret in the Lesser Antilles, you need to prepare for heavy rain, gusty winds, and potentially rough surf along the coast. Here are what the ensemble members are stating at this time, and we do see a vast majority of them want to take this due west. We do have this one ensemble member wanting to take a landfall towards Puerto Rico, but that ensemble member is considered an anomaly. So we should take the where the ensemble members are taking this storm as the most likely scenario. So make sure to keep that in mind throughout the Lesser Antilles and potentially the Central America as well, since this could bring an enhanced amount of moisture to you guys, as well as Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, even though the eye will likely be a lot further south from those islands. Here are what the ensemble members are stating when it comes to the intensity of Tropical Storm Bret as it continues to move further eastward, and a vast majority of them agree that this will primarily stay at around tropical storm strength. I wouldn't rule out a low-end Category 1 just yet. The upper level winds are relatively weak, so this could maybe develop just enough of a well-defined center of circulation for this to develop into a hurricane. But I'll still say that a strong tropical storm is the most likely scenario with Tropical Storm Bret when it comes to its intensity. And here are what the model ensemble members are stating as well for Invest 93L, which likely will become Tropical Storm Cindy. And we do see that a good amount of them want to take this further northward, avoiding the Caribbean islands, but some of them still come uncomfortably close to the Caribbean islands. So we still could see adjustments to where potentially the Caribbean islands could get affected in the near future, depending on how much ridging there will be just to the north of it. The stronger the ridging, the more likely this would move further west and impact the Caribbean. We just have to wait and see, but it's likely going to it likely won't develop into a very powerful storm due to the same reason as Tropical Storm Bret. The lower level winds are just very strong this time of the year over the main development region. And here's the amount of rainfall you should expect from Tropical Storm Bret as it continues to head further westward. We do see that the Lesser Antilles could experience anywhere from 3 to 5 inches of rain, which could cause localized flooding in certain areas. And same goes for portions of Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and Haiti. With this enhanced rainfall that Tropical Storm Bret is bringing, you could experience potentially over 3 inches of rain, which could lead to flash flooding. So you definitely need to be aware of those possibilities if you live in flood prone areas. So here's my forecast when it comes to Tropical Storm Bret and potential Tropical Storm Cindy. So I do expect this to become a borderline or hurricane as it approaches the Lesser Antilles. So you need to be highly aware of this, as this could bring major impacts when it comes to flooding and gusty winds over those islands. And for Puerto Rico as well as Hispaniola, be aware of enhanced rainfall, rough surf, especially along the southern shore, and maybe gusty winds right up along the southern coast. So definitely pay close attention to that, but I do expect it to weaken once it reaches maybe around 70 miles per hour in strength once it encounters a more hostile environment before completely dissipating by the time it approaches the Western Caribbean. But Tropical Storm Cindy could maybe come uncomfortably close to the Caribbean islands depending on how much ridging there is, but I'll still say the most likely scenario is that it should avoid the Caribbean islands. But be aware of all scenarios when it comes to Tropical Storm Cindy, because by the time this approaches longitude of the Caribbean, it should be around 5 to 6 days from now, which is still a lot of time to iron out the forecast. So stay tuned for more updates when it comes to Tropical Storm Cindy in the future. But thank you guys for watching.